The morning sun rose gently over the small village of Daria, casting long golden shadows across the narrow dirt roads. Roosters crowed, children laughed in the distance, and old wooden carts creaked under the weight of routine life. Among these sounds, a different noise began to draw attention: a low, steady dragging, punctuated by the rhythmic clink of a metal chain. Max, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick coat and intelligent eyes, was struggling. His strong legs strained against a leather harness strapped to his chest, which was connected to a heavy wooden cart piled with sacks of dried grain. Dust rose around his paws as he dug in and tried to move the load forward, inch by inch. His tongue hung from the side of his mouth, panting, as sweat soaked his fur under the summer sun. Max belonged to Mr. Hader, an elderly man who had once been known as the village's most dependable farmer. In his youth, he could lift full sacks by himself and drive the cart with ease, but those days had faded. A stroke the year before had left him partially paralyzed, and now he relied on Max to deliver grain to the market across town. The villagers admired the bond between man and dog, but lately, some whispered that the burden was becoming too much for Max. Today, the cart was heavier than usual. Rain from the night before had dampened the sacks, making them weigh nearly double. Yet Max, faithful as ever, showed up at sunrise and began his usual route. His paws pressed into the soft earth, his muscles tensed with every pull. His breath came in short bursts, but still, he moved forward. People watched, some from their windows, others from shop doorways. A few children stood on the side of the road, fascinated by the sight of a dog doing a job meant for a mule. One boy laughed, not cruelly, but out of surprise. "Look at him go," he called out to his friend. But no one stepped in. Most assumed Max would figure it out. As he always did, a vendor stacking fruit crates outside his stall crossed his arms and frowned. "This isn't right," he muttered, watching Max slip slightly as the cart hit a bump. "That cart's going to break his back someday." Still, no one moved. Max reached the center of the village and paused to catch his breath. His tail was low, ears flat, but he didn't sit. He looked back at the cart, then toward the market road, then forward again. No complaints, no growls, just quiet determination. A few passers-by clapped lightly, more out of respect than real concern. Then, the unexpected happened. One of the straps on the left side of the harness slipped. The cart tilted ever so slightly and stopped moving altogether. Max whimpered softly, trying to adjust himself, but the angle of the cart had shifted. He leaned in harder and gave one big pull, but nothing. The cart didn't budge. His legs began to tremble, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. Nearby, a woman stepped out of her house with her baby in her arms. She was humming a lullaby as she moved to her garden, completely unaware of the scene across the street. Her baby, Zoya, barely over a year old, squirmed in her arms and pointed toward Max. Curious and bright-eyed, the baby had noticed something, that the grown-ups had ignored: the way Max's body shook with effort, the way his paws dug hopelessly into the dirt. And in that tiny moment, with the village frozen in indifference, one pair of small hands reached toward the road. That single gesture would change everything. But for now, Max stood alone, his loyal heart pulling more than just a cart. He was dragging the weight of being forgotten. And in Daria, that weight was about to become too much for one Doug to carry alone. The village of Daria had always been known for its simplicity. People here valued their traditions, looked after their own, and believed in quiet living. But over the years, something had changed. Maybe it was the slow arrival of technology, or maybe the newer generation didn't feel the same connection to one another. Whatever it was, that morning, the heart of the village seemed to beat a little slower. Max stood frozen in the middle of the street. His fur was now coated in a mix of sweat and dust, and the sunlight was beginning to sting his eyes. He blinked, but didn't sit. The cart behind him leaned slightly to one side, one of its old wheels creaking from the uneven pressure. The strap across Max's chest had loosened, and it tugged awkwardly against his shoulder, yet no one came forward. The man at the tea stall, Rafik, stirred sugar into a cup with a metal spoon and glanced toward Max. He frowned again, louder this time. "That dog's gonna hurt himself. Where's Hader Sahib? Why doesn't he hire someone?" The man sitting next to him nodded. "We all loved Max when he was a pup, but this is too much." But their words stayed at the table. No one walked over, no one lifted the load. They just watched as Max tried again, one paw forward, then another, only to fail. Across the street, a group of teenagers sat on a low wall, laughing and scrolling through their phones. One of them casually recorded Max for a few seconds, probably planning to post it online later. "Look at this dog," he said. "Thinks he's a tractor." A few meters away, inside a second-floor window, old Mrs. Nazia stood behind her curtain. Her eyes softened as she watched Max. She remembered when he was just a tiny pup with oversized ears, chasing birds in Mr. Hatter's garden. She remembered the day Max barked nonstop until he got someone's attention, saving Mr. Hader during a medical emergency. She whispered, "Poor soul," but like the others, she didn't step outside. Max let out a soft, defeated sigh and looked back at the cart. His tail hung low, brushing the dirt behind him. He didn't understand why the load felt so much heavier than usual. He didn't understand why no one helped, but he remembered Mr. Hatter's voice that morning, gentle and grateful. Just, to the market, Max. That's all. That promise still echoed in his ears. At the far end of the road, a small child's voice rang out with a sudden, cheerful squeal. Zoya, the baby who had been watching from her mother's arms earlier, had now wriggled free. Her tiny feet, barely steady, pattered across the ground as she made her way toward the street. Her mother, Aisha, turned around just in time to see her daughter take off toward the road and quickly followed. Zoya, no, not there, she called out, rushing after her. But Zoya wasn't scared. Her focus was on Max. With every innocent step, she seemed determined. To her, Max wasn't just a dog. He was something much bigger, something she didn't yet have the words to explain. A hush fell across the villagers as they watched the toddler reach the cart. Aisha finally caught up and scooped her up, apologizing softly. But even in her arms, Zoya kept pointing. Her chubby finger aimed right at Max. Her expression was serious. Not like a baby demanding candy, but like someone who had seen something wrong and wanted to fix it. But Max turned and looked at her too. For the first time that morning, his ears perked up just slightly. Something about her presence, her energy, shifted the air. The dog took a deep breath and tried again to move the cart. The effort was smaller, but the intention was strong. A wheel turned just a little. The silence among the villagers was heavy. Guilt crept into some hearts and discomfort into others. How had it come to this? A toddler, barely walking, showing more compassion than the entire street. The village of Darya wasn't heartless. It had simply forgotten how to act. But that morning, thanks to one baby's gaze and one dog's loyalty, the heart of Darya was beginning to stir again, and it wouldn't be long before it beat louder than it had in years. Zoya was too young to understand weight or struggle. She didn't know what a cartload of grain felt like, nor did she understand the years Max had carried it alone. But she could sense something wrong in the way Max stood, tired and frozen. His paws, once full of energy, now trembled slightly. His eyes didn't sparkle the way they had when he ran behind the family truck during evening strolls. Zoya reached out again from her mother's arms, making little squeaky sounds that only babies could get away with. Aisha looked down at her daughter, confused, trying to soothe her with soft whispers. Baby, it's okay. But Zoya kept pointing at Max, her tiny hand insistent. Max, too, didn't look away. His ears twitched, his body stiffened, and his head tilted just a bit. It was as if he recognized her not just as a face from the village, but as someone different, someone unafraid, someone who hadn't judged or passed by. Then, to everyone's surprise, Zoya wiggled again, and this time Aisha gave in and gently led her down onto the dusty road, staying close behind her. The baby toddled forward with slow, deliberate steps. She walked toward Max with the innocence of someone who didn't see a burdened animal but a friend in need. A small crowd had gathered now, not large, but enough to make the moment feel important. Shopkeepers paused their work. Fruit vendors leaned on their carts, and a few elders stood quietly under the shade of the banyan tree. No one spoke, but every eye followed the baby as she made her way toward the tired German shepherd. When Zoya reached him, she stopped beside the wooden wheel. Max looked down at her, panting slightly. The baby placed both hands on the cart's edge, pressing her soft palms against the rough wood. She gave it a little push, barely making it move, even a fraction of an inch. Still, she smiled. The gesture was small, almost laughable in terms of strength. But it wasn't about that. It was about intention. She had done what no one else in the village had. She had tried. Max let out a small, low whine. It wasn't a sound of pain. It was something gentler. He lowered his head and lightly nudged her arm with his nose. Then, carefully, he licked her tiny fingers. A few gasps came from the crowd. A couple of older women whispered blessings under their breath. Even the teenagers who had earlier mocked Max now stood with their phones lowered, watching quietly. Something was happening, something none of them could explain but all of them could feel. Then came the moment that stayed in everyone's memory for years. Zoya reached up again, this time using both her arms to lean into the cart. She wasn't strong enough to make it move, but Max, inspired by her effort, gave the harness a small tug. And the cart moved. Only a little but enough. One of the wheels clicked forward half a turn, and the wooden body of the cart straightened slightly. The crowd exhaled almost in unison, as if they too had been holding their breath. It wasn't just Max pulling, it wasn't just Zoya pushing. It was a moment of quiet magic, the kind that didn't need explanation or translation. Aisha knelt beside her daughter and wrapped an arm around her. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "You did more than anyone here." Zoya giggled and clapped, proud of her own effort, unaware of the change she had just sparked. In the hearts around her. From the far end of the road, an older man began walking toward them with careful steps. His name was Musa, the village carpenter, known for being gruff but kind-hearted. He had a towel over his shoulder and a piece of rope in one hand. I think that strap's about to give out, he said gruffly as he reached Max. Then, looking at the cart and then at the baby, he added quietly, let's not wait for another child to fix what grown men should have handled. He knelt beside Max and began adjusting the harness. And just like that, the stillness broke. The village, after watching in silence for too long, was ready to move again. But this time, they weren't just watching. They were ready to help. The village of Darya had always moved slowly, like the river it was named after. But today, something inside it stirred. As the carpenter Musa tightened the leather straps around Max's harness and adjusted the old wooden yoke, a wave of quiet murmurs rippled through the growing crowd. Max stood still, allowing Musa to work, his chest rising and falling slowly as he caught his breath. His tongue hung from his mouth, but his eyes looked calmer now, softer, as if he sensed the burden was no longer his to carry alone. Zoya, still beside the cart, remained focused. She reached out with one small hand and touched Max's paw, a baby's touch, innocent, warm, without fear or hesitation. Max looked down again and gently pressed his nose against her shoulder. The crowd watched, breath held, as if any sudden movement might disturb the purity of the moment. She's only a year old, someone whispered, but she's the only one who did something, another replied. A few men stepped forward, embarrassed by their earlier inaction. One of them, Harun, a young farmer in his 20s, scratched his head and said, all right then, let's get this cart moving. He walked to the front and took hold of the cart's wooden frame. Behind him, another man joined. Then a woman came forward, brushing flour from her apron. Then two teenage boys stepped in beside her, their earlier smirks now replaced with quiet resolve. Max looked around, puzzled but encouraged. He shifted his weight slightly, prepared to pull again, but this time, he didn't have to. The hands around the cart began to push. Slowly, steadily, the wheels began to turn. The cart creaked and groaned under its weight, but it moved. Inch by inch, it rolled forward. The street, once lined with silent onlookers, now echoed with the sound of effort shoes scraping against dirt, wooden wheels spinning over pebbles, and soft grunts of people working together. Zoya clapped again, her giggles lighting up the dusty air. Aisha scooped her up and held her tight, overwhelmed by the emotion of it all. She looked around at her neighbors, each one helping in their own way, and whispered, she didn't just help the dog, she woke us up. From his porch, old Mr. Hader had finally come outside. Leaning on his cane, he squinted toward the road. He couldn't walk fast, but he made his way slowly toward the sound of the movement. As he reached the center of the path, he stopped and saw it his cart, no longer dragged by Max alone, but guided by half the street. Box noticed him first. The dog's ears perked, and his tail began to sway in a tired but proud rhythm. Mr. Hader called out in a cracked voice, Max, my boy, you've done it again. The people around turned to greet him. Harun, still holding the cart, nodded respectfully. He had help this time, sir, from the tiniest one among us. Hader's eyes shifted to Zoya in her mother's arms. He smiled, and something behind his old weathered face lit up. He stepped closer and reached out to gently touch Zoya's hand. Thank you, he said softly. Aisha nodded, tears in her eyes. She didn't know what she was doing, but she knew it mattered. The cart was now past the toughest part of the road. The rest of the way to the market was downhill, smoother. The villagers, feeling both humbled and lifted, began laughing softly, shaking their heads at how a baby and a dog had reminded them of something they'd forgotten, that helping didn't always require strength. Sometimes, it just required heart. Musa tightened the last strap on the side of the cart and stepped back. It'll hold now, he said, but maybe it's time. Max got a lighter job. Mr. Hader chuckled and nodded. He's earned his rest, the villagers agreed. As the cart continued its slow journey, now with people on both sides guiding it, Max walked not in front but beside it, tongue out, eyes half closed in peace. He wasn't pulling anymore. He didn't need to. Zoya, in her mother's arms, waved toward Max. He turned his head, gave one soft bark, and wagged his tail. That gentle exchange, witnessed by dozens of eyes, felt louder than any speech could have been. By mid-morning, the village of Darya had fully awakened, not just in routine, but in spirit. The air no longer carried the usual weight of indifference. It now buzzed with something else, connection. People who hadn't spoken in weeks were now working side by side, pushing the cart Max once pulled alone. As the cart moved along the main road, a young girl named Sana stepped out from her family's bakery holding a loaf of warm bread. Without hesitation, she broke off a piece and held it out to Max. The shepherd paused, sniffed it gently, then took it in his mouth, chewing slowly with quiet appreciation. His tail wagged lazily as if to say thank you. Sana smiled. He looks tired. One of the older boys replied, he's a hero. Others nodded. They no longer saw just a dog. They saw dedication, loyalty, and above all, an example. Max had never asked for help, never complained. He had simply shown up every day to do what needed to be done, and it took the smallest among them to remind everyone that such loyalty deserved support, not silence. The cart reached a resting point near the village square. where large banyan trees offered welcome shade. The group paused there, wiping their brows and catching their breath. The sacks of grain still needed to reach the market, but no one seemed in a hurry anymore. The rush had been replaced by something more meaningful, a sense of unity. Zoya sat on a cloth spread out on the ground, drinking water from a cup held by her mother. A few children gathered around her, curious about the baby who had done something no adult had dared to do. One of them leaned over and said, "She's not even 2, and she already changed the village." Aisha chuckled softly. She doesn't know that. To her, Max was just a friend. Mr. Hader, sitting nearby on a wooden bench, was surrounded by old friends. They talked quietly, reflecting on how they had allowed one loyal dog to carry such a burden for so long. One of them, a former teacher named Arif, looked at Hader and said, "We forgot the meaning of community." Hader nodded. "We became too busy, too distant. But today, today feels different." From a nearby house, a man appeared with a small toolbox. "This cart needs repairs," he said. "I can reinforce the wheels. No charge." Another offered, "I'll paint it. Give it some color. If Max is going to walk beside it, it should at least look nice." And then, the idea began to take shape. A volunteer group. Nothing official. No paperwork. Just a group of people committed to helping one another. Someone suggested calling it the Max Circle. The name made people laugh at first, but it stuck. After all, if a dog could remind a village of its heart, then it only made sense to carry his name forward. That very evening, posters went up around the village notice board. "Help when you can. Ask when you must. We're all in this together." Max reminded us. The local mosque announced that volunteers would gather every Friday to identify those who needed assistance: older residents, single parents, or anyone carrying more than they should alone. Teenagers who had spent hours on their phones now walked around asking where they could help. Some elders began teaching younger ones how to fix broken carts, sharpen tools, and repair roofs. The effect spread beyond the village center. Farmers shared equipment. Shopkeepers helped each other restock supplies. The mood of Daria had shifted in ways no one had expected. And through it all, Max continued to walk quietly beside the cart. He wasn't forced anymore. He was celebrated. Children brought him treats. A new padded harness was gifted to him, made by hand from soft fabric. He even had his own water bowl placed outside the mosque courtyard, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting a golden hue over the village. Zoya took her first steps on her own, wobbly but determined, just like Max had been earlier that day. Her family cheered and clapped, and Max barked once, as if in approval that it was a day no one would forget, not because of anything dramatic or grand, but because something small and honest had stirred a sleeping heart. And in Daria, that heart was now beating louder than ever before. The days that followed in Daria were unlike any the village had seen in years. There was a lightness in the air, as if the soil itself had been waiting for someone to stir its spirit. Max's story spread through nearby towns. People came from neighboring villages, not to see the cart or the sacks of grain, but to catch a glimpse of the German shepherd who had pulled more than weight. He had pulled people together. But the biggest shift wasn't in the roads or the routines. It happened inside the people themselves. Every evening, as the sun began to sink behind the rolling hills, villagers would gather at the top of Gulmahar Hill. It had always been a peaceful spot, mostly visited by children or a few wandering goats. But now, it became a place of reflection. People would sit in circles and talk not about gossip or prices, but about what had changed in them. It was during one of those evenings that Mr. Hader stood up with the help of his cane and said something no one expected. "I was wrong," he began. "I thought I had no choice. I thought asking Max to pull that cart alone was the only way. But I see now, I didn't ask for help, not from the dog, not from the village, not even from myself." The group was quiet, listening carefully. I saw Max's loyalty as strength, and it was. But even strength can break if it's never shared. Musa, sitting nearby, nodded. We all thought the same. We all saw him do it every day, and none of us stopped to ask if he should. Hadar looked down at the worn cane in his hand, but it took a baby to show us. Just one small gesture. A woman across the circle added, "Sometimes, that's what it takes. Not a speech, not a rule, just a moment of truth." On that hilltop, the villagers decided to build something. Simple but Listanga-shaded shelter for animals and a small resting platform for those who delivered goods. They named it Zoya's Rest. No matter how small the burden, the idea was no one should carry it alone, not animals. Not people. Max was there too, resting beneath a tree, his eyes closed but ears alert. He had become more than just a working dog. Children called him meaning teacher. Adults simply called him the wise one. One afternoon, a journalist visited the village. He had heard about Max and Zoya and wanted to write a story. After speaking to Hader, Aisha, and several villagers, he sat down with Max, camera in hand, and waited for the right moment. Zoya, wearing a yellow dress, walked up to Max and sat beside him. She reached into her small pocket and pulled out a biscuit. Max gently took it, then rested his head on her lap. The photographer snapped a picture at that exact moment. That image would later go viral, printed in newspapers and shared online under the headline, "When a Baby Helped a Dog, a Village Remembered Its Soul." But for Darya, the headlines didn't matter. What mattered was how things felt now. A group of young boys started walking elderly women to the market on weekends. Teenagers helped paint the mosque's boundary wall. Even the older men, once set in their routines, began spending time with the younger generation, sharing stories and listening. In return, at the heart of it all, Max continued to stroll through the village not as a worker, but as a reminder. His cart, now fully repaired and beautifully painted, stood in Hader's yard as a symbol. It was no longer used for deliveries but for celebrations. Weddings, harvests, and school events all borrowed the famous cart, often led by children who proudly said, "This was Max's." Zoya had started to talk now. Her first words had been the usual ones, "Mama, Baba." But one day, she pointed at Max and clearly said, "Friend." And there it was, the word that captured everything. Not hero, not worker, not even dog, just friend. And in Darya, friendship had proven stronger than anything else. The morning air in Darya had changed. What was once routine had now become purpose. People didn't just wake up to do their own chores anymore. They woke up wondering who they might help. It was as though the smallest heart in the village had reminded everyone of something deep and timeless. Kindness wasn't weakness, it was strength. Little Zoya, now just over a year and a half, had no idea she had become a symbol. She still giggled when she saw butterflies and clapped when she saw Max stretch under the banyan tree, but her presence alone now carried weight. When she walked through the market with her mother, people smiled. When she pointed at something with her chubby fingers, others looked too, just to see what she saw. Her simple gesture that day, placing her hands on the cart beside Max, had become a kind of village parable. Children whispered it to each other. During games, elders used it as an example when talking about compassion. Even the village teacher, Miss Farida, wrote it on the chalkboard one morning. "You don't need strength to change the world. You just need heart." One Friday, after the afternoon prayer, the imam of the mosque stood before the congregation and paused longer than usual before beginning his speech. He looked out at the familiar face, some wrinkled, some youthful, all changed in ways he had rarely seen in his decades in Darya. "We've heard many sermons," he began, "but sometimes the most powerful ones don't come from the pulpit. Sometimes they come from a child, or a dog, or a moment of silence broken by a soft touch." Everyone knew who he meant. That week, something unusual happened. Letters began arriving in the village. Not official letters, but handwritten notes and cards from nearby towns. From people who had read the journalist's story or seen the now famous photograph of Max resting his head on Zoya's lap. One card said, "Your village reminded us what it means to care." Another read, "Thank you for showing us that even a child can lead the way." And the most moving of all came from an old woman in a distant town. She wrote, "I had stopped believing in people, but when I saw your story, I cried. Then I baked some bread and gave it to my neighbor for the first time in years. Thank you, Zoya. Thank you, Max." The villagers were stunned. They hadn't done anything dramatic. No rescue missions, no grand speeches. Just a baby who acted on instinct and a dog who never gave up. But somehow, the simplicity of that moment had reached far beyond their borders. Inspired by this, the villagers came up with a new idea, message wall. They cleared a section of the outer school wall and painted it white. Every villager was encouraged to write something on it, a message, a memory, a lesson. People of all ages came with chalk and markers, adding words in different languages, even drawings of Max and Zoya. Zoya, of course, couldn't write, but Aisha helped her press her painted palm against the wall, leaving a tiny handprint in bright orange. Next to it they wrote, "Start small, love big." Max sat nearby as they painted, his tail sweeping the dust gently as he watched. He didn't understand the wall or the attention, but he knew he was loved. And for a dog who once pulled a cart in silence, that was enough. One evening, during a village celebration, a small stage was set in the square. Children recited poems, played music, and shared stories. When it was Zoya's turn, Aisha carried her up. She didn't say much, just one word as she looked out at the smiling faces. Together, it was barely a whisper, but it was heard, and it struck everyone that this baby who had once reached out to help a tired dog had now reached into their hearts. Her message wasn't long, but it was clear. We belong to each other. The wooden cart stood proudly in Mr. Hader's yard, freshly painted in bright blue and decorated with colorful flowers and hand-painted patterns. It was no longer the heavy burden it once was, dragged through dusty roads by a loyal German shepherd. Instead, it had become a symbol, a reminder of the village's journey from indifference to togetherness. Max, now older but still full of quiet dignity, lounged nearby beneath the shade of the big banyan tree. His eyes, once filled with the strain of endless labor, now sparkled with calm and contentment. Children ran past him, laughing and calling out his name, and he wagged his tail softly in greeting. Mr. Hader smiled as he watched the scene unfold. The old man's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his shawl, but his spirit was strong. He thought back to that morning when Max had struggled, alone and determined, pulling the heavy cart. It had been a turning point not just for Max, or for him, but for the entire village, thanks to a tiny toddler who stepped forward without hesitation. The village had rediscovered something it had lost: compassion. Neighbors had formed a community group called Max's Helpers. They took turns assisting with deliveries and chores. Sometimes, the cart was pulled by children, their small hands gripping the wooden handles, laughing as Max walked beside them, his pace steady but relaxed. Zoya, now walking confidently and full of life, often joined the group. Her eyes lit up every time she saw Max, her little friend who had taught an entire village about kindness. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, the village gathered in the square for a celebration. It was a day to honor not just Max or Zoya, but the spirit of helping one another. Mr. Hadir took the microphone first, his voice strong despite his age. "This cart is more than just wood and wheels," he said. "It carries our stories, our struggles, and our triumphs. But most importantly, it carries the lesson that no one should carry their burdens alone." The crowd applauded warmly. Among them, Zoya clapped her hands and laughed, oblivious to the weight of the words but full of the joy they inspired. Aisha, watching her daughter, felt tears well up. She knew the journey had not been easy. There had been moments of silence, hesitation, and fear, but in those moments, a tiny spark had grown into a flame that warmed every heart in Darya. Max was led to the center of the celebration, where the children gathered around him. They gave him treats, stroked his fur, and told stories about how he had never given up. One boy stood up and said, "Max showed us that loyalty is more than a word. It's an action," a girl added, and Zoya showed us that even the smallest hands can make the biggest difference. Together, the villagers sang songs of unity and hope. The old wooden cart, once a symbol of struggle, now rolled gently through. The crowd, led by many hands and accompanied by joyful voices. As the stars began to twinkle above, Mr. Hader looked at Max and whispered, "You taught us all what it means to be family." Max rested his head on Mr. Hader's knee and let out a soft sigh of relief, love, and belonging. The village of Darya had been changed forever, not by grand events or sweeping changes, but by a dog's determination, a baby's courage, and a community's heart. In the heavy cart, it was no longer a burden, it was a beacon, a reminder that when people come together, if in the smallest ways, they can carry the heaviest loads.